My name is Gilles Parenteau, and I am 74 years old, and I have been a faller for 41 years, a camp foreman for 11 of those, and I have never in my life spoken of what I am about to say to anyone outside the 22 men and 3 women who were present for it, except once to my wife Denise in the spring of the year she died, which was the 2nd of March. 2 years ago, this past winter. That is the reason I am speaking now. Denise was the last of those 25 people, and when she went, she took with her the only witness I had left, and I decided that night, sitting at the kitchen table with her coffee cup, still on the counter, and the recorder my son-in-law gave me sitting beside it, that if the story did not leave this kitchen while I still had the breath to tell it, it would not leave at all. So, I am 74 years old. I logged the Upper Chibougamau watershed for the better part of my working life, and what I am about to describe took place over a period of 30 years, from the autumn of 1968 to the late winter of 1998, at and around Camp 14 of the Desrosiers timber operation, which no longer exists. The bunkhouses collapsed now, and Older taking back the cleared ground so thoroughly that I have stood at the edge of that site in recent years and could not tell you with certainty where the cookhouse wall once stood. I am going to tell you what we found, and why we covered it back over, and why I believe, after 30 years of returning to that place in memory, that what we chose to do was correct. It begins with Fernand Coté, who was 53 years old in October of 1968, which made him the oldest man in the camp by a considerable margin, a Cree Québécois man from the territory north of Matagami, who had been cutting timber since he was 16 and who had, in Desrosiers Timber's employment rolls, no surname other than Coté, which he had taken from a foreman who had given him work when he was young, and which he wore without particular attachment in either direction. Fernand was the kind of man who did not waste words, and I do not mean that as a figure of speech. I mean that in the 4 years I knew him, before this event I had heard him speak perhaps 300 sentences in total, and every one of them had been a complete and sufficient sentence, nothing excessive, nothing performative. He was the best faller I have ever worked beside. He read a tree the way some men read faces, understanding its weight and lean and hidden rot from the outside, and he was never wrong. I am telling you this because what Fernand reported to me on the morning of the 22nd of October, 1968, he reported in precisely the manner I have described, completely, without exaggeration, and in very few sentences. He said he had found something behind the old bunkhouse. He said it was a place, not a thing, though there were things in it. He said I should come and look before I said anything to the rest of the crew. I came and looked. Behind Camp 14's older bunkhouse, the one we called the Grey House, because no one had ever painted it, there was a stretch of ground that ran perhaps 40 meters from the back wall to the first line of black spruce, and in that strip of ground the crew stored equipment in the dry months, and walked between the outhouse and the bunkhouse, and did nothing else of consequence. It was not a place anyone paid attention to. In the northeast corner of that strip, where the spruce came closest to the building, and the ground was perpetually shaded and damp. Even in summer, the soil had been disturbed. That is the first word I reach for when I think of it now. Disturbed. Not dug. Not excavated. Disturbed, in the sense that something had been tended. The ground had been turned over in a rough oval, perhaps 2 meters long and 1 meter wide, and set into the turned earth in a deliberate pattern were the following objects. The partial skull of what appeared to be a large ungulate, either a moose or an elk, positioned at what I took to be the head of the oval. 3 river stones of significant size, arranged in a line below the skull, each stone smoothed by water and carried from somewhere, because there was no river within 4 kilometers of that site. A bundle of spruce boughs, dried and tied together with a strip of hide that I could not at that time identify, placed across the 3 stones, and a depression at the center of the oval, perhaps 30 centimeters deep. When I pressed my hand into it, filled with something I took at first for dark soil, but which, when I sifted it with my fingers, I understood was ash, old ash, mixed with what I will describe only as the remnants of something organic, something that had been committed to fire and then gathered and returned to the ground. I did not remove anything. I looked at it for a long time, and Fernand stood behind me and said nothing, and then I stood up and brushed my hands on my trousers and said to Fernand, "What do you make of it?" He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "Someone put it there on purpose." I said yes. He said, "And they came back to it more than once, because some of those stones have been moved." I looked again and saw that he was right. There were faint arcs in the soil around 2 of the 3 river stones, the marks left by an object rolled slightly and then returned. Fernand said, "I have seen graves before, and I have seen ceremonial sites before, and this is both of those things, and neither of those things exactly." That was the most I ever heard him say at once. We did not tell the crew that day. We did not tell the crew that week. I want to be precise about this because I know how it sounds. 2 men finding something like that and choosing silence. But I want you to understand what the alternative was. The alternative was to report it to the Des Rosiers timber office in Chibougamau, which would have meant a supervisor driving out, which would have meant a report to the provincial ministry, which would have meant an interruption to the cutting season that the company would not have accepted quietly, and which would have meant the site being investigated by people whose relationship to that ground was entirely procedural and who would have had no instinct for what it was asking of them. Fernand and I both knew this without discussing it explicitly. What we discussed explicitly was only what we intended to do. Continue the work, watch the site, and see whether whatever had made that place came back to it. That is all. We were not heroic about it. We were practical men making a practical decision, and I want to be honest about that. I did not have to wait long. The 3rd week of November, 1968, on a Tuesday morning when the temperature had dropped to something in the range of -22, and the crew had gone out to the cutting block and left Fernand and me at camp to address a mechanical problem with the skidder. I was crossing the strip of ground behind the grey bunkhouse, and I stopped. The oval of turned earth had been attended to. The spruce bough bundle had been replaced with a fresh one, and the 3 river stones had been moved, not by the small arcs I had noted before, but decisively repositioned, the leftmost stone now turned on its side. The ash in the central depression had been added to. The depression was shallower than when I last measured it with my hand. Someone or something had been there between the last time I had looked, which was 2 days prior. And that morning, the temperature had been well below freezing for 5 consecutive nights. There was no snowpack yet. The ground was frozen to a depth of perhaps 8 centimeters at the surface, and I could find no clear track in the frost, because what little frost remained was in the shadow of the spruce, and whatever had crossed the open. Ground had done so in a manner that left no clear impression in the harder surface. I crouched beside the oval for a long time, and then I went and found Fernand and told him. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "It will come again." It came again on the 4th of January, 1969. I know the date with precision, because I had begun keeping a small notebook, which I have still, in which I recorded each change to the site and the date I observed it. By the 4th of January, I had documented 7 separate instances of attendance at the oval, each time a small alteration, a stone moved, a fresh bundle placed, the central depression replenished with ash, once a 3rd river stone added to the original 3, so that there were 4 in the line. I had seen nothing. I had heard nothing. On the 4th of January, I was awake before the crew at 5 in the morning, because I slept poorly in winter, the cold working into a shoulder I had broken in 32 and never had set correctly, and I was standing in the doorway of the grey bunkhouse with my coffee, looking at the strip of ground behind it, which was visible from the doorway only in part and only at that angle, and I saw it. I want to be careful about how I say this. I did not see it clearly. The light was not yet what you would call morning light. It was the particular darkness of a winter pre-dawn in the boreal, which is not a complete darkness, but a graduated grey, in which shapes are visible, but their details are not. And what I saw was a shape, and the shape was large. It was crouched at the oval. Its back was to me. I could not have said in that moment what it was. I could say only that it was large, larger than any man, and that it was crouched at the oval, with what I could only describe as deliberateness, and that it remained there for perhaps 4 or 5 minutes, while I stood in the doorway without moving. And then it rose. When it rose to full height it was, I would estimate, between 8.5 and 9 feet tall, broad across the shoulders in a way that read as solidity rather than display, and dark, the fur or hair, whatever it was, dark brown in that pre-dawn light, so that it read as one piece with the darkness behind it. It stood fully upright for a moment, and then it moved to the tree line and was gone. I did not cry out. I did not move. I stood in the doorway for some time after it had gone, and then I went back inside and sat at the table and wrote the date and the time and a description of what I had seen in my notebook, and my hand was not steady, but the writing is legible. I told Fernand the next morning. He listened to the entire account without interrupting. And when I finished, he was quiet for long enough that I wondered whether he intended to speak at all. And then he had said that he had suspected something of that nature since the first morning he had found the site, and that he had not said so because he did not want to say things he could not support. I asked him what he understood the site to be. He said he thought it was a memorial of some kind, and that whoever or whatever had made it there because of some proximity to that spot, some connection to that piece of ground, that the grey bunkhouse had been built perhaps on or near something that had already existed, and that the being I had seen and whatever else was connected to it was not visiting the site, but returning to it, which was a different thing. Thought about the distinction Fernand drew between visiting and returning for 30 years, and I believe he was correct, and I believe that distinction is the key to understanding everything that followed. I need to tell you about the bunkhouse itself, and about what Fernand had known before he found the site. The grey bunkhouse had been built in the late 1940s by a Desrosiers foreman named Boyven, who was long dead by the time I arrived at Camp 14. and it had been built on ground that the original Des Rosiers site maps designated as cleared, though Fernand told me that an older trapper named Savard, who had worked the territory before the timber operation, had described the location to him differently. Savard had told Fernand, years before the events I am describing, that there was a place in that stand of spruce, that he did not go, that he had come upon it once in the mid-1930s while running his line, and had recognized it as a site of significance, and had rerouted his line accordingly. Savard had not described it to Fernand in detail. He had said only that it was a place where something was tended, and that it was not his to disturb, and that this was not a belief of his, but an understanding. The kind of understanding a man arrives at in the bush when he has been paying attention for long enough. Savard was Métis, and Fernand trusted his reading of the land in the way that serious men trust other serious men, without needing to share every assumption behind the trust. Fernand had remembered this when he found the oval behind the grey bunkhouse, and it was why he had come to me before going to anyone else. What followed over the next months, and then over the following years, was not dramatic. I want to be honest about that too. There were no confrontations, no emergencies, no nights of particular terror. There was instead a slow and patient education, which is not the word I would have used at 31 years old, but which is the word I find accurate at 74. I documented the site through the cutting seasons of 1969, 1970, and 1971, and in that time the pattern I had observed continued. Regular attendance at the oval, alterations to the objects within it, the occasional addition of a new element, twice a small bundle of what appeared to be birch bark rolled tight and tied, once a fragment of antler laid beside the line of river stones. I saw the being itself on 9 further occasions over those 3 years, always in low light, always at a distance, always attending to the oval with the same quality of deliberateness that I had noted in January of 69. I told no one in the crew. Fernand knew, and that was sufficient. We did not discuss the being between observations. We discussed the site itself, its changes, what those changes might mean, in the quiet and empirical way that two men who trust each other can discuss something that neither of them can fully explain. In the autumn of 1971, Des Rosiers expanded the camp, and among the things expanded was the crew. And among the new men who arrived that autumn was a man named Theodore Hamel, 26 years old, from a family of Lac Saint-Jean woodsmen going back 3 generations, who became in short order one of the best fowlers in the operation, and also one of the men I trusted most completely in my working life. Theodore was observant in the way that the bush makes men observant when they are constituted for it. He noticed things before he reported them, and he reported them accurately and without embellishment. In his 3rd week at Camp 14, he asked me about the oval behind the grey bunkhouse. He had found it on his own, not because Fernand or I had led him there, but because he had been walking the perimeter of the camp in the early morning, as he said he always did, in a new place, learning the ground, and he had come upon it. He did not ask what it was. He asked whether I knew it was being maintained. I said I did. He looked at me for a moment, and then he said, "All right," and that was the end of the conversation. He joined the circle of those who knew, which was by that autumn 3 people, without being asked and without ceremony. By 1974, the circle was 7 people, Fernand and Theodore and I, and 4 others, a cook named Odette Bergeron, who had taken over the cookhouse the previous spring and who had the quality of absolute composure that I have only ever observed in people who have survived something genuinely terrible before the age of 40 and come through the other side with their gentleness intact. A skidder operator named Bertrand Soucy, who was small and wiry and funny in the dry way of a man who has decided that the absurdity of existence is funnier than anything a comedian could invent. A young faller named Mathieu Caron, who was 19 years old and who had grown up on stories his grandmother told him about the boreal that had prepared him, I think, better than any of us for what he was asked to accept, and a mechanic named Claude Veilleux, who said very little about the being but who began, without being asked, to ensure that the strip of ground behind the grey bunkhouse was not included in any new construction planning, which twice saved the site from being built over when the company sent directives about expanding storage. We did not vote to include these people, and we did not hold a meeting, and we did not ask anyone to take an oath of secrecy. What happened was simpler and harder to explain. Each of them found the site on their own, or was led to it by proximity to another who knew, and each of them, upon understanding what it was, made the same decision that Fernand and I had made in October of '68. They did not speak of it outside the camp. They watched over it as a matter of course. That is all. That is everything. The autumn of 1977 is when the nature of the site changed for me and when I began to understand more of what we were keeping watch over. I was 43 years old, and I had been foreman for 6 years, and in that time I had seen the being at the Oval perhaps 30 times in total, always at distance, always in low light, never in a manner that invited closer observation or suggested that closer observation would be welcomed. I had understood the site as memorial and had left my understanding there, which was correct as far as it went. What I did not understand, and what became clear to me in the autumn of '77, was the scope of what was being remembered. That autumn, while making a routine check of the site in late October, I noticed that the oval itself had been extended. Not dramatically, perhaps 20 centimeters added to its length. On the eastern side, the soil turned fresh there, and the pattern of the arrangement within it shifted slightly to accommodate the extension. Within the extended area, there was a new cluster of ash, and within that ash, when I sifted it carefully, I found 3 objects. I found a small hand-formed clay vessel, cracked but intact, of a type I did not recognize. I found a tooth, a single large molar of a size that I understood did not belong to any animal in the regional fauna, and I found a fragment of what appeared to be leather, worked in a pattern I could not interpret. I did not remove any of these things. I photographed them with the camera I had begun to bring to the site, and I replaced the ash over them exactly as I had found it, and I went back to my notebook and wrote it down. I showed the photographs to Fernand that evening. He looked at them for a long time. He said, "I think there is more than one of them buried here." I said that I had thought the same thing. He said, "And I do not think this is recent." I said I agreed. He said, "This has been a place for a long time, more than the camp, more than Savard. A long time." I said I understood that. He said nothing else. But that night I sat at my notebook for a long time, thinking about what it meant to be the keeper of a place that was old in a way that had no simple measure, that had been old before the camp was built on it, before Savard ran his line through that territory, before the first Desrosiers man came north with a chainsaw. The Oval was not simply a grave. It was a continuity, A place where what was gone was returned to on a regular schedule by what remained, and the maintenance of it was not grief in the human sense, or not only grief, but something more like the performance of a relationship that had not ended simply because one party to it had died. I have thought about that distinction for 30 years too. I do not have a better way to put it now than I had then. By 1983, the circle of those who knew was 14 people. 4 of the original 7 had moved on to other operations or retired, and among the new men and women at camp, there were those who found the site as Theodore had found it, and those who were told, and in every case the response was the same, which was quiet acceptance and quiet watchfulness. I want to name them because I believe naming is a form of honor, and because these are not famous people and no record of what they did exists anywhere else. There was a faller named Gérard Poirier, who was the funniest man I have ever known, and who was also capable of a silence at the site. That was unlike his silence anywhere else, a different quality of it, deeper. There was a pair of brothers named Victor and Simeon Lacasse, who worked different seasons, but who shared the knowledge between them, with a naturalness that told me they came from a family accustomed to keeping things sacred. There was a cook's assistant named Pauline Turcotte, 22 years old, who told me once and only once that she had grown up near a place like this, though she did not say where, and who seemed to find in the site something she had expected to find all along. There was a skidder operator named Denis Marchand, who was not given to speech of any kind, and who expressed his participation by maintaining the small fence of stakes that he had quietly installed around the perimeter of the strip behind the grey bunkhouse, a fence that served no official purpose, but that kept equipment and foot traffic away from the eastern side of the oval, without anyone from the company ever asking what it was for. There were others. They are gone now, all of them, or as good as gone, and I name them because they deserve to be named. The winter of 1987 was the winter I saw the being most clearly, and the only occasion on which I would say it was aware of me in a way that was particular, that was addressed to me as an individual, rather than experienced as the general awareness that a large and intelligent animal maintains of its surroundings. It was February, and the temperature was severe, something in the range of -34, and I was awake in the early hours. For the same reason, I was always awake in the early hours. At that temperature, which was the shoulder, and I had pulled on my coat and boots, and gone to the window of the office, which I used as sleeping quarters in those years, and which faced east toward the strip of ground behind the grey bunkhouse. The full moon was high, and the snow was hard packed, and the light was sufficient to see clearly across the strip, more clearly than I had ever seen it in the pre-dawn dark. The being was at the oval. It was crouched, as it always was when attending to the site, but it was facing toward the office window, which meant it was facing toward me. And the light was enough that I could see its face, which I could not have described with precision before that night. The face was broad and deep-browed, and the eyes were set back under the brow, so that they were in shadow, but the shadow was not impenetrable, and what I saw in the eyes was this: attention, not alarm, not threat, not the reflexive alertness of an animal that has scented danger. Attention of a specific kind, the kind that a person has when they are looking at something they have already thought about. It looked at me for what I would estimate was 30 seconds, and then it looked back down at the oval and it continued what it was doing, which was the addition of something to the central depression. The motion deliberate and unhurried, and when it rose to leave it, did not look back at me. I stood at that window for a very long time after it was gone. I have thought about those 30 seconds for 37 years, Ma. I do not know what the attention meant. I know that it was not nothing. I know that the being had been attending to that site through the tenure of 3 different foremen and countless rotations of crew, and that I had been foreman for 19 years at that point. And I believe, though I cannot prove it, that what I saw in those 30 seconds was something like recognition, the acknowledgement of a particular person who had been in a particular place for a long time without causing harm. I may be wrong about that. I have told myself I may be wrong about that for 37 years. But I do not think I am wrong. I retired from Desrosiers Timber in the spring of 1992, having spent 28 years in the Chibougamau operation, the last 18 as foreman of Camp 14. Theodore Hamel took over as foreman when I left, and I trusted him with the site as I had trusted Fernand, which is to say completely and without condition. I did not visit the camp again during the active cutting years. The operation continued through the 1990s, and Theodore wrote to me twice, letters in the plain, precise style that was characteristic of him, informing me that the site remained intact and continued to be attended to, and that the circle of people who knew it remained a circle, and that nothing had changed in the essential nature of things. What changed was the company. Desrosiers Timber was acquired by a larger operation in 1995, and the new ownership applied different criteria to the remaining camps. And by the spring of 1998, Camp 14 had been assessed as marginal, and the decision had been made to close it. The closure was announced in January of that year. Theodore wrote to me in February, and I drove north to the camp in March, the second week of March, arriving on a Thursday morning in weather that was still deep winter, the road in from the highway not yet softened by the approaching thaw. There were 12 people at camp for that final season, and of those 12, 6 knew the site. Theodore and I met with the 6 that evening in the cookhouse after dinner, and we talked for 3 hours, which was the longest single conversation about the site that had ever taken place, and the only conversation that was organized and deliberate rather than happening, in the way that such conversations between people who share a quiet knowledge tend to happen, which is gradually and at oblique angles over long periods of time. What we discussed was what to do. The camp was closing. The buildings would be abandoned, and within a few years they would begin to fall, and within a few decades the alder and willow would come in, as they always came in at abandoned campsites in the boreal, and the ground would return to what it had been. Before Boivin built the grey bunkhouse on it in the late 1940s, the oval itself would be covered, and then uncovered as the forest reclaimed the ground, and the objects within it would persist or deteriorate as the conditions permitted. What we were asked to decide was not whether to do something, but what form our last act of stewardship should take. There were those in the conversation who felt we should do nothing, that what was in the ground had persisted without our help for much longer than we had been present, and that our presence had in some sense been the interference, not the protection. There were those who felt we should cover the oval more deliberately, add to the depth of soil above it, give it more protection against the disturbance that comes with abandonment and eventual recovery of a site. There was no disagreement about the fundamental principle, which was that we would not remove anything. We would not document anything officially, and we would not tell anyone outside that room what we knew. I did not vote in that conversation because I was not in the habit of thinking of these things as votes. But my feeling was with the second position, and it was Theodore's feeling too, and in the end, the group reached the same conclusion through the kind of quiet process that the keeping of a secret produces in the people who have kept it for a long time, which is that they come to resemble each other in their decision-making, without having made any deliberate effort to synchronize. We spent 2 days in that second week of March doing what needed to be done. We deepened the soil above the oval by approximately 30 additional centimeters, and we laid fresh spruce boughs across the entire disturbed area, and we placed the 4 river stones, which had grown to 7 by that point, through the additions of 30 years, in a final arrangement at what had come to serve as the head of the site. We did this without ceremony, because we were not people who performed ceremony, and I do not believe ceremony was what was needed. What was needed was attention and care, and we provided those things. On the last morning I was there, the morning of the 14th of March, 1998, I walked to the strip of ground behind the grey bunkhouse alone, before the crew was up, in a cold that had softened somewhat from the deep winter of the previous weeks, maybe -12, a light snow falling straight down in the windless air and settling on the boughs we had laid. I stood at the site for a long time. I did not say anything, because I am not a man who speaks when there is no one to speak to, and when the speaking would be performance rather than communication. I stood and I looked at the ground, and I thought about 30 years and what they had contained. I thought about Fernand Cotte and his 300 sentences, and the precision of the sentence about visiting and returning. I thought about Theodore and the letters and the plain style. I thought about Odette Bergeron's composure, and Denis Marchand's fence, and Pauline Turcotte's single sentence about growing up near a place like this. I thought about a face seen in February moonlight, and the quality of attention in it, and whether I had read that attention correctly, or had made of it what I needed to make of it, and I concluded, as I always concluded, that I could not know for certain, and that the uncertainty did not trouble me as much as I might have expected it to, because what I had done with that uncertainty was watch over something, rather than exploit it, which seemed to me at 74, as it seemed to me at 64, and as it had seemed to me at 31, when I first knelt beside a disturbed oval of earth in the corner of a strip of ground behind an unpainted bunkhouse, to be the only reasonable response to the limits of what we can know. That was the last time I was at the site. The camp closed in June of that year. The road in from the highway was decommissioned by the company in 2002, which means access now requires a 3-hour walk through regrowth. And I have made that walk twice since my retirement, once in 2009 and once in 2019. And on both occasions, I found what I expected to find, a site in the process of being reclaimed. The grey bunkhouse caved and green with moss, the strip of ground behind it, rising slowly in alder and young spruce. The particular corner where the oval had been overgrown and indistinguishable to any eye that did not know to look. The ground does what ground does. It takes back what has been placed in it, and it is not hurried about it, and it does not explain itself. I do not know what is buried in that oval. I have my inferences, which Fernan shaped in 1974 when he looked at my photographs and said he thought there was more than one of them buried there. I have the evidence of 30 years of attendance, the regularity of it, the care with which it was performed in every season, and in conditions that would have kept any sane human being indoors. And from that evidence, I draw the conclusion that what is in that ground was beloved in a manner that did not diminish over time, which tells me something about the nature of the being that maintained it, regardless of what that being was or is. I do not know whether the being still comes to that site. I cannot know because I cannot get to it without a long walk and a younger body than the one I currently possess, and because even if I could get to it, I would not be able to read the freshness of the ground the way Fernand could. I hope it does. I hope that under the alder and the young spruce and the 30 additional centimetres of soil we laid in March of '98, whatever is in that oval is still being attended to by whoever has reason to attend to it, and that the closure of the camp and the decommission of the road and the return of the forest have made that attendance easier rather than harder, which seems to me the way it ought to be. I am recording this on the 2nd of April, 2024, at the kitchen table of my house in Roberval, Quebec, in the late afternoon, with a cup of coffee that has gone cold because I have been talking for longer than I intended. My son-in-law's recorder is on the table. My notebook is beside it. Denise's cup is in the cupboard now, as it has been since she died. I took it down this morning to hold, and then I put it back. She was the last of the 25, and I am speaking now because I promised her that if she went first, I would tell it. And she went first. She said that the world needed to know that there were people who chose to watch over something they did not understand, rather than explain it or possess it. And I said that I was not sure the world would believe it. And she said that the believing was not the point, that the point was the telling. She said this without sadness, as she said most things, and I believed her. The coffee is cold, and the recorder is still running, and outside the window it is the ordinary grey of a Quebec April afternoon, the last of the snow going out of the yard in streams. And somewhere north of here, in the ground behind a bunkhouse that no longer stands, there is something that was tended for 30 years by ordinary people who asked nothing in return. And I do not know what it is, and I am glad, and that is all I know how to say.